When the Beckers moved into their new home, strange things soon began to happen. Small at first, lights flickering and objects moving. But as the strangeness escalated, the Beckers realised that they weren't alone. The dead were there too, and they weren't going to leave. This would be an all-out war between the living and the dead, the true story behind the first ever televised exorcism in the USA. Brace yourselves, because this is going to be a spooky one.
Oh ho ho, I'm ready. Bring it on.
The year is 1970, and the Beckers, Ed and Marcia, were frantically looking for a new place to live. You see, Marcia was 7 months pregnant and their current landlady wanted no children in her apartments. This was completely non-negotiable, and the Beckers would soon be kicked out. Ed came across an ad for a 2-flat apartment building on Campbell Street in Chicago. It was offered as an air estate, so somebody must have died, but this didn't bother Ed though. You see, the price was very appealing and it seemed like a fantastic opportunity. Ed arrived at Campbell Street on a sunny July morning, filled with hope that this could be their new home, that the search would be over. The building was nothing special to look at, straight up and down. But it was spacious. There'd be more than enough room for Ed and his growing family. The estate agent greeted Ed with a smile and a firm handshake, and then he took him inside for a tour of the building. They would start on the 2nd floor, because Myra, one of the heirs to the property, still lived on the 1st floor. Just as they began to climb the stairs, Myra burst out of the doors to the 1st floor apartment. An elderly lady covered in dirt, her eyes wild, her hair matted, and in her arms was an equally dirty poodle. She began swearing at them. Oh, the language she used, and then she started screaming for them to get out. The estate agent was clearly used to dealing with these outbursts and told her to go back into the apartment. She begrudgingly complied, slamming the door behind her. The property needed a lot of work, but Ed didn't mind. It was nothing that he couldn't fix. As the tour concluded, the estate agent emphasised that the property had been on the market for such a long time. The owners were desperate to be rid of it and they would sell for a very reasonable price. This was music to Ed's ears because money was very tight. Ed was only 24 years old, you see. They were a young family just starting out in life.
I am getting strong stay away vibes here. There's a reason it's been on the market for so long.
Yep, I think you're probably right. Anyway, a deal was reached which allowed Myra to stay for 3 months after closing. Ed wasn't too enthused about this, but she'd pay $120 a month and they could certainly use the money. Ed would visit the property a few times between closing and moving day to get a bit of a head start on the renovation works. Of course, he was usually met with a torrent of abuse from Myra. "You don't belong here. We don't want you here. We don't," she yelled, before beginning to laugh hysterically. "You don't own this building. You can never own this building." "We? Who's we?" Ed thought. Maybe she meant her and her poodle. Moving day quickly arrived and Marcia and Ed could barely contain their excitement. Their future was looking brighter than ever. Their new little bundle of joy, Christine Ann, had been born in October, and now they were the proud owners of not 1 but 2 apartments. The excitement, it wouldn't last though. The Beckers would find out that we did not mean Myra and her poodle. There were others in the building and they would soon make their presence known. One morning when Ed was getting ready for work, he ran himself a bath. The apartment didn't have a shower. He firmly placed the old rubber plug into the drain, made sure that the water was the right temperature, and then left the bath to fill. After finishing his morning coffee, Ed went to check on the bath and he couldn't believe it. The water was still running, but the plug was no longer in the drain, and the chain it was attached to was wrapped around the faucet. This was strange. He was sure that he put the plug in the drain, but maybe he was mistaken. He brushed the incident off and headed into work. He called home to see how Marcia was doing, but the line was busy. It was busy all day. When he arrived home, Ed asked Marcia why she'd been on the phone non-stop. Their phone bill would be absolutely astronomical at this rate, and money was tight as it was. Marcia was confused. She hadn't been on the phone at all. You see, the phone was in the living room at the other end of the apartment, and she spent the day in the kitchen. They had a cat, Kitty she was called, and she loved the living room. She would pass the day in there curled up on a soft velvet chair. Perhaps she'd knocked the phone off the hook. As time went on, Ed and Marcia found that they would spend most of their time in the kitchen, with Christine close by in a bassinet. But strange things started to happen in here too. Marcia noticed that certain items had begun moving around the kitchen. The dishes would be out of place, the broom wasn't where she left it, and small appliances just seemed to move about. She started to suspect that something wasn't quite right, that maybe the apartment was haunted. She didn't say anything to Ed though. You see, Ed worked with computers and he was a very logical person. He certainly did not believe in ghosts. The Beckers were Catholics, and the day of Christine's baptism soon arrived. The parish priest, Father Barnes, would conduct the ceremony. He also agreed to come over for lunch, and whilst he was there, he would bless the building too. The christening was a joyous occasion, with close friends and family in attendance. After the ceremony, they all made their way back to the flat for a nice buffet lunch. Ed asked Father Barnes to bless the house before they ate. He agreed and took a brass holy water dispenser and a Bible out of his pocket. He would bless each room in turn, starting with the living room. He began reciting the blessing and shook the dispenser to sprinkle holy water around the room. As he raised it, it violently exploded, shattering into tiny pieces.
The holy water bottle exploded? If there was ever a sign to pack your bags and leave, that was it. Definitely something evil in the house.
I know, pretty scary. Father Barnes was shocked, as was everyone else in the room. Ed could see the fear in the priest's eyes. Father Barnes, his face now pale, picked up the pieces of the dispenser, his hands shaking. He turned to Ed and said, "I must leave now." Father Barnes couldn't wait to be out of that house. He was in such a fluster to leave that he opened the closet door by mistake and walked straight into a rack of coats. He realised his mistake, mumbled something, and then was off out that front door, striding away. Ed, Marcia and the guests were confused and shocked at what had just happened. The ghosts in the house? Well, they were not happy with this attempted blessing at all. It was an affront to them, and they would let the Beckers know. The next day, Marcia was sitting in the kitchen, watching one of her favourite shows on the portable black and white television. Suddenly she heard a strange buzzing noise. She turned around to try and see where it was coming from, and then she realised that the hand mixer that was hanging on a hook on the wall had turned on by itself and was vibrating away. She watched in disbelief as it then lifted off the hook, rising high into the air, where it remained suspended for a moment. The mixer then began floating towards her before falling at her feet.
Really? They moved a mixer? Yawn. If I was a ghost, I'd really give people something to be scared of.
I really do tell.
I can picture it now. Black ooze, flying gargoyle heads, hellfire, everyone and everything would be levitating. They'd have moved out in a day.
So, basically the Amityville Horror, but Gargi style.
No, much scarier.
If you say so, Gargi. Ed would get a taste of the supernatural, too. He would hear slow, deliberate footsteps on the back porch, but no one was there. There was also the strong and suffocating smell of burning wood in the basement. It was coming from the potbelly stove, but it was never used. He would hear a man and a woman constantly arguing out on the back porch. He would soon realise, though, that it was the same argument being replayed over and over and over again. The phone bill finally arrived, and Marcia was vindicated. The bill was not, in fact, astronomical. It was tiny, with hardly any phone calls having been made. Ed would learn that no matter how many times he put the phone on the hook, the receiver would always end up lying next to the phone. Next, the kitchen lights would begin to flicker, and the kitchen door would keep opening all by itself. Now, this wasn't a loose door, and this wasn't the wind, because the doorknob would turn on its own before the door flew open. Quite understandably, Marcia hated being left in the house on her own, and so Ed decided to get her a dog called Holly to keep her company. She was a really sweet dog, but soon she began to growl and bark as if something dangerous was in the house. Marcia eventually opened up to Ed that she thought the apartment was haunted, but he was having none of it. There was a logical explanation for it all. He was in complete denial. One evening when Ed returned home from work, he was greeted by Myra. For once, she was not shouting profanities at him. "I'm moving out this week, you know," she said. "I'm glad I'm leaving. I was tired of you coming into my apartment at night and moving things. You moved my table and chairs and you put the cigarettes out in my coffee cup, didn't you?" Ed looked at her, confused. He certainly hadn't been coming into her apartment. After Myra moved out, Ed would begin renovating the first floor apartment so that he could rent it out. He saw tall black figures out of the corner of his eye, and he heard furniture being dragged around, but there was no furniture in this apartment now. The Beckers quickly found tenants for their newly renovated apartment: Dave, Ellen, and their new baby, Laura. Barely a week went by before they too started having odd experiences. The power went off every time they played music, their plates broke, and the chandelier in the dining room would move. Poor Marcia was cooped up alone at home a lot, so Ed started driving home for lunch to keep her company. One Monday, as he pulled the car to the curb, he saw an elderly lady sitting outside on the front steps. She was wrapped up in a heavy coat. It was a gloriously sunny day, so this was a bit out of place. Ed walked up the stairs and said hello to the old lady. She didn't say anything, but she smiled warmly at Ed. She must be visiting the new tenants, he thought. Whenever Ed came home for lunch, the lady was always there. She'd smile and nod, but never said a word. One day, Marcia asked Ellen who the nice old lady that kept coming to visit was. Ellen responded, "What old lady?" In April, Ed would finally meet his next-door neighbour, Walter. The two would get on like a house on fire, and Walter would invite Ed over for a drink. Now, he would learn more about the history of the house. First, Walter told Ed about the elderly mother that lived there. "She died of a broken heart," he said. "She had a huge falling out with one of her sons." He moved just down the road, and he would pass the house on a daily basis. She'd sit by the window, waiting for him, sometimes even calling out to him. But he never responded. He wouldn't even look in her direction. He ignored her until the day she died. Ed's suspicions began to rise. What did she look like? He asked. "Old, grey and frail," Walter replied. "Normally overdressed, as if she was cold all the time. Sometimes she would sit out on the front steps, wrapped up in a wool coat, even when it was warm outside." Did she die in the building?" Ed asked. "Yes," Walter replied. "On the first floor."
Oh, that's so sad. She's still waiting for her son.
"I know." Ed asked if anyone else had died in the building. It would turn out that the building had been home to many, many tragedies. The elderly father who had actually built the house had died there. One of the sons, Ben, had died in the bathroom, and it was actually his death that prompted the sale of the building. Apparently, Ben and his wife were constantly arguing, and Ed's mind wandered to that argument that was replaying over and over again. Sadly, Ben's wife would hang herself in the basement. Another son, Henry, died mysteriously in a bedroom on the first floor. He always seemed sad, and his face looked twisted and tormented. In total, there had been 5 deaths in the building. Ed was finally convinced that they did indeed have ghosts, and he'd seen one of them, the woman on the stairs. He wasn't frightened though. It all became a bit of a game to Ed. The ghosts antagonised him, so he would antagonise them right back.
Round 1. Fight!
He got a new metal bar plug with a trip lever, and he tied the kitchen door shut. He wasn't going to let them win.
Go, Ed, go. 2 points to Ed. We are rooting for you.
Round 2. Fight!
The ghosts, of course, retaliated. The next morning, the Beckers awoke to a freezing cold house. Some of the space heaters wouldn't turn on. The valves for these were in the attic, and something had moved the levers into the off position. Ed's keys would keep going missing from the key rack, and they would turn up in the strangest of places, like the sink and on top of cabinets. Each time he found them, the garage key would be bent into an L shape. Why always the garage key? Ed wondered.
Oh, they're neck and neck now. 2 points to the ghosts.
Wait, I'm not finished yet. They had one more trick up their sleeves. Now the ghosts would do something a little dangerous. They would turn on the stove. Luckily, Ed caught it before anything bad happened. But for the first time, Ed was frightened. It probably came as little surprise for Ed when their tenants, Dave and Ellen, gave their 90-day notice. You see, Ellen had confided in him about the ghostly activity they'd been experiencing. She didn't tell Dave at first. He was far more superstitious than her, and he would have wanted to move out straight away. As time went on, though, Ellen began to fear for their daughter's safety. There was clearly a presence interacting with her. She would coo and motion for them to pick her up. Ellen caught a glimpse of him once. His face was scary and distorted. Ed thought that the description matched Henry's. Eventually, it all started to become too much for Ed and Marcia. They'd lost their dog, Holly. She'd run away after an encounter with something truly terrifying that nobody else could see. The ghosts dominated their thoughts. The activity, it was never ending, constantly escalating. They worried about what might happen next. How far would they go? Ed turned to Father Barnes for help, but he was insistent there was nothing he could do. This was a matter that the Catholic Church could not involve themselves with. The Beckers were truly desperate now. At this point, they would have tried anything to get rid of those ghosts. They wished they could move out, but they couldn't because they'd be absolutely financially ruined if they did. Marcia turned to the Yellow Pages to see if she could find anyone that could help them. She contacted Illinois Psychic Research and spoke to a man called Tom Valentine. He seemed very professional. After an initial interview, Tom returned to the house again, this time with some other members of his team. Joseph DeLuise, a renowned psychic and ordained minister, and his protégée, Barbara. Their inspection of the house took over an hour, and when they finished, they were clearly shaken. Joe had a very serious look on his face and said, "There is more than one ghost. I believe that one of them is dangerous and intends to do you harm." Ed asked about the ghosts, making sure not to give any of his knowledge away about the building's history. Joe told Ed that he felt an old woman who was harmless but was trapped for some reason. There were at least 2 men, one younger and the other much older. He feared that the younger one was evil. Barbara then chimed in, "There's one in the garage too. She hung herself in there." "No, she hung herself in the basement," Ed blurted out. "Well, at least that's where the body was found." "No, she definitely died in the garage," Barbara replied. "If the body was found in the basement, it was moved there." It then dawned on Ed that that's why the garage key was always bent into an L shape. Joe urged everyone in the household to wear a crucifix and told Ed to stop antagonising the ghosts. Yep, knew about that little game. The team would return a few days later for another investigation of the building, this time bringing an exorcist with them, Reverend William Durrell Davis. You see, they feared that the malevolent spirit might not have been a spirit at all, but a demon. After this final investigation, Joe told the Beckers their plan of action. They would attempt an exorcism to free the spirits, and they would be in touch when they were ready. Ed and Marcia eagerly awaited their call. Their phone rang and they rushed to pick it up, hoping it was Joe or Tom. But it wasn't. It was NBC News respondent Carol Simpson. Word of the exorcism had gotten out, and Carol wanted to report on it. The Beckers saw no harm in it, if the reporting was done in a serious manner, and so they agreed. This would be the first televised exorcism in the US. The day of the exorcism finally arrived. The NBC crew readied their equipment and excitedly chatted among themselves. They'd never been involved in anything like this before. As Joe and Reverend Durrell Davis made their entrance, dressed in their clerical robes, their excited chatter turned to silent anticipation. The exorcism would take place in the dining room. The two made the dining table into a makeshift altar, with a white cloth candles, and a large brass crucifix. Joe then sat praying quietly off to the side of the room. The ceremony would soon begin. Reverend Daryl Davis made it clear that once they started, absolutely no one would be allowed to leave, not until the ceremony had reached its full conclusion. He had a very commanding presence, and everyone realised that he was being deadly serious. He would be making no exceptions. He then followed this up by urging all who stayed to wear a crucifix. It was at this point that many had a change of heart. They were far too frightened to stay and quickly made their way out of the building.
Oh, really? But they'll miss out on all the fun. Exorcisms are always so dramatic.
I'd have left too. I don't need that kind of excitement in my life, thank you. Reverend Daryl Davis explained that they would pray for God's assistance. Joe would then go into a trance and attempt to make contact with the spirits in the house. He would hold a small cross and a mirror. The idea was that the spirits would realise that they had no reflection and were no longer of this world. This was dangerous business. If Joe went too far into the trance, he could be possessed. And that's where Reverend Daryl Davis would come in. He would keep a close eye and make sure that this didn't happen. The ceremony would now begin. There was no turning back. The two prayed for 20 minutes before Joe began to enter a trance. His eyes closed, his body went limp, and his breathing slowed. Suddenly there was a huge gust of wind, and the blinds rattled. None of the windows were open. Everyone watching quickly clung onto the crucifixes around their neck. The room became cold and dark. The air felt thick and heavy. Something was there. Joe began uttering, "You must leave. You don't belong here." He held out the cross and the mirror. "Can't you see you have no place here? Why do you stay?" he asked. Reverend Daryl Davis urged Joe to come back, to not go too far. Joe then took a deep breath and spoke in a voice that was clearly not his own. It was the voice of an elderly woman. The picture, I need the number." Reverend Daryl Davis seemed shocked, but he quickly regained his composure. "Why does it concern you?" he asked, his voice strong, unwavering. There was no response. "Why does it concern you?" he asked again. "I need the number," the woman's voice responded. Reverend Daryl Davis urged Joe to come back, to not go any further, his concern growing as Joe's face twisted and contorted with pain. He told the spirit that they didn't belong here, to look at the cross, at the mirror. They were not of this world. "The combination, the number, I need the number," the woman's voice continued. "Why does it concern you? You do not need the number any longer," Reverend Daryl Davis responded. He spoke with confidence and authority. Finally, Joe seemed to regain control of his body. In his own voice, he told the spirit that they must leave, that they had no reflection in the mirror. They didn't belong here. Then there was the sound of a single bird chirping, then another, and another. So loud was the sound of the birds chirping, it was as if hundreds had gathered outside. Joe continued to demand the spirit leave, while Reverend Daryl Davis kept urging Joe not to go too deep into the trance. This went on for at least an hour, before Joe suddenly opened his eyes and the life came back to his body. "Are you finished?" Reverend Daryl Davis asked. Joe nodded, slowly. The two sat together, praying in silence, before Daryl Davis announced, "This house is clean. This house is pure. Anything that bothers the individual in this house comes from the individual himself." They then sealed the house with blessed salt, spreading it across every opening. Once everyone had left, Ed and Marcia sat in silence. The house was silent. It was beautiful, peaceful. They went to bed, happy in the knowledge that their house was pure. It was clean. The silence, it wouldn't last though. They awoke to the most terrifying sound, a sound of pure anguish, a woman loudly crying out and sobbing uncontrollably. The exorcism had failed, and the ghostly activity resumed once more. Ed's sister, April, was obsessed with all things paranormal. She convinced Ed to let her move into the first floor apartment with her husband Jim and their 2 children. April was young, only 21, and was thrilled to be living in a house with ghosts. She'd invite all her friends round and host seances, candlelit affairs where they tried to contact the dead. The ghostly activity was exciting, it was novel. The chandelier would move, the basement door would open. She'd ask the spirits to play her piano and they'd oblige, playing a few keys. Then she bought a Ouija board and started to communicate with a spirit called Henry. Remember, he died on the first floor. Her personality began to change. Once the most gentle and loving mother, she would now scream at Jim to beat the children if they misbehaved. She was always on edge, always angry. Meanwhile, Ed was doing everything he could so that he and Marcia could move out. He'd taken on 2 extra jobs so that they could save up enough money to buy another apartment building. Word of the Ouija board got round to Ed and he was furious. Tom Valentine had told him about his research into the things, how they changed people, how they ruined lives. Ed marched downstairs to see April and demanded that she hand over the board. She could see how angry Ed was, and so she complied. He smashed the board into pieces. April began to see Henry's face, twisted and distorted. She was plagued by nightmares of a dark, hooded figure. She constantly felt something brushing up against her. It was Henry. He was after her. He wouldn't leave her alone. April was deteriorating right before Ed and Marcia's eyes. She started hearing voices. She started talking to herself. She was thin and pale. She wasn't eating or sleeping. Her eldest son kept talking to somebody that wasn't there. It was Henry, he said. April now feared for her life. She stopped playing with the Ouija board, stopped encouraging the spirits. But it was too late. The door was already open. Ed was so worried about his sister, and so he spoke to Jim, pleaded that they move out for April's sake. But he wouldn't listen. Eventually, Ed's hard work paid off. He bought another 2-flat building, so Ed and Marcia would soon be moving out. And they were truly ecstatic. Ed spoke to Jim again and told him that they should come with him to his new apartment. They could live on the 2nd floor. Jim couldn't be convinced though. This apartment was close to his work. Ed and Marcia finally moved out, and the new apartment truly felt like home. It was warm, it was welcoming, and definitely free of ghosts. They had a sense for these things now. Things might have been looking up for Ed and Marcia, but they certainly weren't for April. A month later, she would vanish in the middle of the night, taking nothing but her purse. Jim frantically ran everyone that he knew, but nobody had seen her. Ed and Marcia knew that she must have seen something truly terrible, truly terrifying, that caused her to leave, just like their dog Holly had. The next day, April would contact Jim. She wasn't coming back under any circumstance. She was leaving her children and her husband behind. It was years before Ed would see his sister again, and she wouldn't tell anyone what had happened that night. Whatever it was so traumatic that for the rest of her life she would sleep with the light and the radio on every night. The Beckers kept the Campbell Street building for a little while, attempting to rent it out to various tenants. They never told the tenants about the ghosts, hoping that maybe things would be different for them, that they wouldn't draw the ghosts out. Things were not different though. They would all experience the same hell and quickly move out. They eventually sold the building to a real estate agent that was very interested in the paranormal. Sadly, after the purchase, his life would take a turn for the worse. He became very ill, his marriage ended, and he moved away. So, what really happened here? Well, it's a very believable story. Ed was a super rational guy, a skeptic who didn't believe in the supernatural at all. The events slowly wore him down and forced him to become a believer. There were multiple witnesses to the phenomena, which makes it all the more believable. The ghostly activity was also quite subtle, relatable even. It didn't feel like it was embellished. Now, if it wasn't ghosts, and I'm not saying that it wasn't, what could it be? Well, common causes for perceiving paranormal phenomena are things like infrasound, sound with a frequency below 20 Hz. It can make you feel uneasy and like there's a presence in the room. It can even make you see things that aren't there, and making your eyes vibrate. Carbon monoxide poisoning has also been a cause for people believing that their houses were haunted. It can lead to hallucinations, memory difficulty, a feeling of dread, and much, much more. They were new parents, which might have resulted in sleepless nights, and lack of sleep can cause you to see all manner of strange things. This, combined with the power of suggestion, might have created the perfect environment for mundane occurrences to be seen as paranormal. Whatever the case, the previous owners of the Campbell Street building definitely had a strong and powerful attachment to it. They'd built it, lived in it, and died in it. It was home to their tragic story, and their imprint will forever remain. If you got something from this video, Guardian and I would really appreciate it if you liked and subscribed. Stay safe. If holy water bottles start exploding, run for the hills. And I hope you have a magnificent day.